So even though I present this as a booktube channel to be somewhat intelligible about my niche, I tend not to really follow booktube goings-on very much. Occasionally I'll watch a video on this stuff, but most of what I learn about booktube is from one channel, Allison Talks Books, which is interesting. She started about the same time as I did. She also idiosyncratic collection of books, about the same number of subscribers, but she's way more tuned into booktube stuff than I am, and she was also consistently putting out about 2 or 3 videos a week when I was first 6 months, 4 videos out, and then now I'm doing daily videos. But anyways, so she is a good source for stuff that's going on booktube that might be interesting, and she did a video end of March about April. There is this thing about April, you should be reading books about people, like biographies and memoirs. And so I'm looking at that, looking at the examples that she is raising, and most of them don't seem that interesting to me, but I'm thinking about, there are actually a lot of books that have been really useful to me in terms of memoirs by scientists generally, or biographies of scientists. Well, really 3 biographies, and that's going to be a separate video, because I realized I have so many memoirs. Even I have realized, like, if I was going to include every book by a scientist who had substantial passages on their life and the context of the research, I would have at least like 24 books on that list. So this is just books that are primarily memoirs that contextualize the research these scientists did. And then I'm going to have a separate video on biographies, which there's really 3 that I've read that impacted me. And then there's a couple more that I want to read. And then I might also have another video on works by scientists that are more conventional monographs, but with a lot of memoir-y stuff thrown in. And you can see for this video, I've pulled at least 1 book. There's actually 2 from behind me, because 2 of these books are memoirs that are relevant to this discussion. And so the very first book on my list is actually, it's the only one of these that I haven't read in the past few years. I read this one back in undergrad. It's the book Bastard Tongues by Derek Bickerton. And I played with the light trying to get it to show up better, and it's not, so I might do an insert showing the cover. I read the hardcover from the library, but I didn't like the price of the used hardcover, so I got the paperback. And I think I want to reread this one, because I was explaining his contributions to the field of Creole linguistics, because he basically revolutionized that field. And I realized I'm like 80% certain which direction it was, what people believed before, and what they believed, or what Bickerton demonstrated, but I'm not completely sure, and I don't want to give misinformation when I know I'm not confident. So I'll just say he upended what we believed about Creole languages. And the most memorable thing about this book for me, the thing that really stuck with me, is he wanted to do an experiment to prove basically that Creole languages are sort of the innate grammar that humans default to, and then other grammars develop out of that, with an experiment where he would take, so 24 couples, I believe it was, might have been 24 people, but he would take people speaking a bunch of different languages, different typologically, linguistically, and have them living together on a desert island and raising their kids together with doctors and psychologists making sure they were healthy and developing fine, and see if they developed a Creole language according to these patterns Creole languages show. And he got it approved by his IRB, but then when he was trying to get funding for it, the person in charge of funding was like, well, you're exploiting these impoverished third worlders by trying to do this experiment, and vetoed it. And so that's a part of this book I remember, but I know that he revolutionized the field of Creole linguistics, and it was an interesting book, and I should reread it so I can explain exactly what way. Again, I'm 80% sure I remember, but not completely. And so then everything else in this list I've read in the past few years, although some of them are writers that I've known about for longer. And so I'm going to do 2 that I read recently that were both on my list of nonfiction books that I should read, which are Primate's Memoir by Robert Sapolsky. And I realize this one, the issue is annoyingly tiny text. This is, I think it's like 8 point, because it seems to be like 9 point is the cutoff of it. I can handle it. But this was really interesting. His voice, like his authorial voice, is a little bit irritating to me, but the stories of his interactions with the baboons and with the locals in doing this research was interesting. And I realized, because my YouTube watch later was getting up against the limit, and so I was cleaning that out, which I used to just move stuff to other playlists, and YouTube made that harder. So I was doing a system for that, and I realized, oh, there are a couple of old videos that I'm meaning to watch by this guy, and I didn't realize it was the same guy, but I remember I watched one of his videos on free will not existing, which is that's my position too, is I'm not a compatibilist. I believe free will doesn't exist, but I also believe that as a practical matter, we have to live our lives as if it does, which I think is his position. That's pretty much people who are not compatibilists but don't believe in free will. I think that's pretty much the standard belief. You don't tend to get many people who actually, nihilists tend to actually believe in free will, weirdly. But anyways, this was really interesting. It's consistent with, I'll talk about Tim Flannery in a little bit. And this also got me really thinking about ape politics, primate politics, which I thought about a little bit from De Waal and Dunbar's work, but seeing the same thing in baboons, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is way more universal in our ancestors than we would like to admit, and there's some consequences of that I'll talk about in future videos. And then also on that list was the book Alex and Me by Irene Pepperberg, which, as I said, this one I just kept putting off reading because I have also lost birds younger than you would expect from the lifespan in captivity because they're long-lived but delicate. That was just going to be hard for me, but she actually foregrounds this, and then it's like, okay, yeah, that was hard, but then this is a celebration of his life. And I'm going to do another video on the books on birds that I most like, and this one's not going to be on it because while I liked it, it's not really about Alex so much as it is about her research, building an institution, and I have another video about that along with the next book that I'll show you in a minute, sort of similar things, but seeing how she managed to do this and completely transform the conventional wisdom on bird intelligence was interesting, and it makes me want to read also Memoirs of Bernd Heinrich, which I have, Gifts of the Raven, I believe it's called, but I haven't read it yet. And then the other book that was in that same video, Secret Life of Bats by Merlin Tuttle. And while this one was really, really interesting in terms of bat behavior, the thing that really stood out to me, and the reason I've said, like, if I was making my own Harvard classics, this would be on it, even though it's like a very modern book, is because he really had to think about the compromises he was making in order to win friends and influence people. And yet he remained optimistic and made those trade-offs and was extremely successful in transforming how people around the world think about at least insect-eating bats. So that was both the bat behavior stuff in this. And there's a lot of fascinating stuff I didn't know about bats. And the changing hearts and minds thing was really interesting to me. And then this next book was recommended by someone who, long story there, but this is on something I'd wondered about for a while, which is the island ecotypes of Anole lizards, which might seem like a weirdly specific thing. And this is by one of the people who did the most research in it. Because basically the question is, so Stephen Jay Gould, and I have a few of his books behind me there, argued that if you reran the tape of life, you'd get completely different results. And the counter argument people say is, well, there's only so many ways you can build a wolf, right? So many ways you can build a crab, which is why things keep evolving into wolves and keep evolving into crabs. And so with these Anole lizards, these ecotypes on these Caribbean islands, you have, so the ecotypes, the big islands have up to 6, and then smaller islands typically have like 2. And they tend to be pretty predictable in the patterns you see. And so he did these experiments where he transferred lizards, like more generalist lizards, Anole lizards, to deserted islands to see, did they start separating into ecotypes, and showed that again and again they did. And that was an interesting book. He also commissioned this cover, which is attractive. It doesn't really have a lot to do with Anole lizards. You would not know it's about Anoles, but fascinating book. And like, I learned about it from one person who otherwise I didn't have a lot of book reading recommendations in common. And it's interesting because it doesn't show up in other discussions of writers that I like. And so I really want to say, if you haven't heard of this one, you're interested in natural history and evolution, and this question of, if you reran the type of life, how much would the animals you see around us look like the ones we have today? I strongly recommend this book. And then next up, and I've mentioned this one before a couple times, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes by Daniel Everett, who I actually got to meet in person. And then I got this one I got used, but I got a brand new copy that I gave to a friend of mine, and I got him to sign. And I was like, hey, if I got a copy of your book, would you sign it for my friend? Because he was a huge fan of Everett, and I didn't really know much about him until meeting him. And Dan Everett is like awesome. Like, he is one of the coolest, nicest star academics you'll ever meet. And this is the story, because he started out as an evangelical, as a missionary among the Piraha, and interacting with them basically made him realize that he couldn't believe in that sort of evangelical Christian idea of God, which unfortunately lost him none of his wife and kids, ex-wife and kids, don't talk to him now because he abandoned that way of life. But he has done a lot of pioneering linguistics research. He's controversial because he's upended a lot of Chomskyan claims, and I tend to side with Everett because I've also met Chomsky, and I've met a lot of people who've known Chomsky, and Chomsky is very intransigent, whereas Everett is very, like, open-minded. And I think generally when you have a debate between someone who is hardcore doctrinaire about their model of the world and someone who is open-minded, most of the time bet on the open-minded person. But this is, you learn a little bit about their language, but you learn a lot about the culture. And this is one of the most illuminating books I have read on primitive, like, cultures. And I realized I forgot to pull, and I don't think I'm going to bother to go down to get it. So the book by James Sussman, Affluence Without Abundance, on the San people, is a similar narrative, but comes to different conclusions about the nature of these hunter-gatherer societies, although it's different environments. And I didn't pull it. I still want to mention that one as well. I would have pulled it if I thought of it in advance. So you can see I'm not remembering every interesting memoir I've read. And then last up, the last two books are, these are both by Tim Flannery, who is a mammalologist, who is best known for his book, The Future Eaters, about the interaction of humans with the natural history of Australasia, so Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, and New Caledonia. And I've read that book twice. I've read a couple of his other books, like The Eternal Frontier about North America twice, and his History of Europe twice. And so this one is one of his first books, and it's basically a memoir of his time doing field research in New Guinea. And then this one, he was doing a survey trying to find rare mammals in the Pacific Islands. And it was interesting, because generally I think of, you got a few interesting animals in islands, like small islands, but generally you get really interesting animals in, like, larger islands. But reading this book, I was like, oh, there's a lot of cool rodents and bats and possums in these islands in ways that I would not have known about if it wasn't in this book. And he also did it on the other side of New Guinea in the Malacca Islands, and he promised he would do another book on that topic. And it has been, like, over a decade, and I don't think he's doing that book, sadly. But both of these, so especially this one was more interesting for the mammals themselves, but talking about the cultures he was interacting with and their way of thinking about the world was interesting. This one was more interesting for the way that these people thought about the world. And I'm not going to get into that, but those, so when I talk about how people think very differently, Tim Flannery and Dan Everett and James Sussman, Affluence Without Abundance, which I didn't pull, these three books combined with papers and conversations I've read about other groups have sort of shown me just how differently humans can think about things that we take for granted, not just even like in Western countries, but when you have state-based agricultural. Oh, and also the book, The Art of Not Being Governed by James C. Scott. But the key thing about these groups is that they are not state-based. And when you have these cultures that are not based on grain agriculture, the way of thinking about the world is very different in a lot of ways that we would take for granted, and that is interesting and illuminating. So, wanted to talk about these memoirs of these scientists that I have found interesting. And as you see by my forgetting to pull Sussman's book, there's probably more of these that I'm not thinking of right now, so I might even do a follow-up if I think of a bunch, but I think these are sort of the top ones, and I'm probably going to do a follow-up on books by scientists that are sort of memoir-ish, have a memoir elements, but are mostly on the research. And it's a tough line to draw, because like this one was mostly on the research, but it was interspersed with like how he was doing it and the challenges, right? So I'm including it. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. This is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.